So, Mark David Hall, welcome to the podcast. And tell me briefly, tell us what you're a specialist in. What's your background been in?
Broadly in political theory, and a little bit more specifically in American political thought, especially focused on the American founding.
Okay, good. And what is the most recent book that you just published?
Did America Have a Christian Founding, which was published by Nelson Books about exactly a year ago in October of 2019.
I've read it. It's really fantastic. Ironically, my thesis in high school was this exact same topic. And I thought you did a fantastic job. It's kind of hard, though, because this is the exact issue that's under attack from the radical revisionist left. What have you seen? What's this historical attack been like? What's happened in the last year or so? What different media forces have attacked the nature of America, the history of America, and the identity of who we are as people in our history?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, boy, for a very long time, 30, 40 years, scholar after scholar, popular author after popular author has contended that America's founders were deists, that they created a godless constitution, that they wanted a high wall of separation between church and state. And so that's nothing new at all. Over the last year, if you want to limit your question like that, one of the most recent things we've seen, of course, is the 1619 Project, which says that basically America is defined by slavery. It's defined by the introduction of enslaved Africans in 1619 in Jamestown. And that, of course, just took fire and is everywhere now.
Well, what are they saying, and how could they make these claims?
The 1619 Project, honestly, is just ridiculous. It's we have to pay attention to slavery in the American context. It's an important reality of the American experience. It must be taught. We must understand it, and yet it hardly is the defining factor of American history. So, if I can jump to the American founding, if I may, I think a far better case can be made that America, in fact, the United States of America was founded in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence on the basic principles, such as we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So many American founders were committed to these ideals. Many American founders recognized that slavery cut against them and were working in the 18th century to end this evil, horrible institution. And this movement continued into the 19th century. Of course, some Americans, blinded by self-interest and other ideas, continued to fight for the institution of slavery. But 8 states voluntarily abolished it between 1776 and 1804. And of course, this institution.
Wait, say more about that. Because the claim is that, major thesis, America definitely was for slavery for a long time. Only eventually, after maybe the more liberal people finally worked slavery out. Right. This is the claim.
Sure. No, it's a ridiculous claim. So,
but if we can show that, if we can actually see evidence that a long time ago, back in the origin, the early history of America, there was Christian movements towards everyone being equal, and then we can show more evidence that slavery was being eradicated as much as possible. That would be really helpful.
Sure. Well, let me take a big step back and say that before 1700, almost no one throughout world history had questioned the institution of slavery. It was practiced everywhere. It's practiced in Europe and Africa and Asia. In North America, Native Americans enslaved other Native Americans. Of the 12.5 million Africans stolen from Africa, only about 4% of them made their way to British North America. The other 96% went to the Caribbean or South America, where slavery was rampant and far more brutal than it was in British North America. By the time we get to the founding era, we have to understand that most white Americans do not own slaves. I think it's fair to say a majority of founders did not own slaves. A number of founders that were involved in writing the Declaration of Independence, for instance, did not own slaves. Roger Sherman of Connecticut never owned a slave, and in fact, co-authored the statute in Connecticut to put slavery on the road to extinction. Someone like Ben Franklin, again, one of the Committee of Five that wrote the Declaration of Independence, had come to the conclusion that slavery was immoral. He owned 5 slaves throughout his lifetime. He freed the last couple in the 1780s, I believe it was, and then went on to become president of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. Even someone like a Thomas Jefferson, we could talk about him later if you want, he clearly recognized that slavery was wrong and did a number of things to help put it on the road to extinction, even though he himself never freed his slaves. So yeah, by the time you get to the 18th century, for profoundly Christian ideas, many, many founders understood that slavery was wrong, that it had to be ended. They voluntarily freed their slaves. They enacted laws, statutes, and other things to put slavery on the road to extinction. It really was only with the invention of the cotton gin in 1794 that slavery got a new lease on life. It became incredibly profitable in the American South. And again, I think it's fair to say that people were blinded, some people, not all people, some people were blinded by self-interest to hang on to this evil, horrible institution into the 19th century.
When can you trace the first policy legislation? When was the first policies enacted that can be shown to someone as being anti-slavery?
So it suggested we might return to Thomas Jefferson. So let's do that. So Thomas Jefferson, of course, the lead author of the Declaration of Independence. After he authored this text, he actually authored a statute in Virginia, for Virginia, that would have abolished slavery in Virginia and sent the freed slaves back to Africa. Now, unfortunately, it was never passed, unfortunately.
What year was this? What year?
This was, I believe, 1778. I'd have to check that exactly, but it was right around there. More significantly, though, he authored what became eventually the Northwest Ordinance. He authored an early draft of it, became the Land Ordinance of 1785. And then eventually the Confederation Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance in the summer of 1787 that said we will not have slavery in the Northwest Territories, the territory that became eventually the states of Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, and parts of Minnesota. Yeah, so we will not have slavery there. We have this evil institution. We don't like it, but we won't allow it to expand. Jefferson authored the draft of the statute. Just utterly amazing.
So
and
Jefferson, in the founding decade, authored legislation and written work to diminish slavery's growth as much as possible, given the context of.
Exactly right. So you have the Mid-Atlantic and the New England states that were abolishing slavery on their own. Again, between 1776 and 1804, 8 states put slavery on the road to extinction or abolished it outright. So the founders, when they were debating the Constitution, they knew this was going on. They also knew that slavery would be not permitted in the Northwest Territories. And so I think there was a great deal of optimism that slavery was on the road to extinction in the debates of the Federal Convention, and they were aware of the Northwest Ordinance. 3 delegates from Philadelphia went to the Confederation Congress, which was meeting in New York City, to provide a quorum to pass the Northwest Ordinance. One of them came back to Philadelphia. So the founders in Philadelphia were well aware of the Northwest Ordinance. Several people, I believe Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth both commented that slavery is on the road to extinction. It's going to go away. We just need to keep the Union together and hopefully bring pressure on the southern states to finally end this institution.
What's the most confusing thing to people is who was responsible for slavery, which side, which school of thought liked slavery, which did not like slavery. And I think one of the most confusing things has been, there has been this notion that different parties switch sides. And what maybe Lincoln was, I don't know if people even know Lincoln was Republican, but if they did, they might think in the back of their mind, they've heard this somewhere, oh, well, things change sides. What are they thinking? Why are they thinking that?
Yeah, well, to answer your first question, again, in the 17th century, it's kind of sad, but no one was really questioning the institution of slavery. It would be sort of like if we could go into the future 300 years and we have a wrecked environment and people look back on the 20th century and saw all of us flying around on planes willy-nilly. It's something we do without a great deal of thought, even though we might be concerned with climate change. But nonetheless, we want to go to Hawaii, so we do it, right? We don't give it a lot of thought. I think slavery was sort of like that in the 17th century. A number of people engaged with it. Those who were enslaved obviously did not like it. Other people were maybe troubled by it, but there was no big movement against it. In the 18th century, Quakers sounded the alarm first. They said, look, this is wrong. This is immoral. Humans are created in the image of God. The New Testament seems to accept the institution of slavery, but there's also deeper principles. The fact that we're created in the image of God, that we're all of one blood, that we ought to treat each other with dignity and respect, that cut against this institution. And they got a pretty big following right away. And I'm not suggesting everyone who opposed slavery was a Quaker, but by the late 18th century, I think it's fair to say almost everyone thought slavery was at best a necessary evil, if not an outright evil. And so you had people like John Dickinson, the largest slave owner in Delaware, voluntarily freed his slaves. I already mentioned Franklin freed his slaves. People like John Adams never owned a slave and drafted the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which almost immediately was held by jurists in the state to prohibit slavery in the state. You just had a profound movement against slavery that was really taking off in the late 18th century. Into the 19th century, it was primarily Christians that were the main forces behind the abolitionist movement. You're exactly, I think you're hinting that Republicans were the descendants of the Free Soil Party that opposed slavery. Yeah, so Lincoln throughout his career opposed the expansion of slavery. He was willing to put up with slavery to keep the Union together, but when the Union fell apart, eventually issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and then of course supported the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, or what became the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that banned slavery, protected the rights of the newly freed slaves, and guaranteed the right to vote, at least on paper.
That's fantastic. What were the people like, the culture like that wanted slavery? Who were they and why did they want slavery? What was the purpose of it? Was it to maintain their economy?
Yeah, so if we're moving to the 19th century, again, no one in the 18th century said slavery was a good thing. With the invention of the cotton gin, cotton becomes an incredibly profitable crop. And the cotton gin saves a lot of time, but you still need a lot of labor to clear land and plant cotton and harvest the cotton. And so I think this created a planter class in the American South that eventually, by the time you get to the late 1820s, 1830s, for the first time, they actually started saying that slavery is a positive good. It's a good thing. I'm not sure any enslaved American would have agreed with that, but this was the argument that they began to make. And eventually, of course, I think you can't understand the Civil War if you don't understand that slavery was at the root of this major conflict.
So you're saying that during the 1700s, the 18th century, 1700s, 18th century, that no one thought of slavery as being a good thing, or you even in practicing it much.
Yeah, that's a strong claim to say no one, but yeah, I'll stick with it.
Right.
I think no one was publicly arguing that slavery was a good thing.
Okay. Also, out of curiosity, when did Europeans first come to America? It was the Mayflower, right?
Well, you had a colony down in Virginia, in Jamestown, but yeah, 400 years ago, this November 11th, the Pilgrims arrived off Plymouth Rock and signed the Mayflower Compact. Yeah, so about 400.
And did they have slaves with them? Or if they did, what was it like?
They did not have slaves, and in fact, when the a Portuguese captain arrived with two Africans that he had stolen from Africa, these early Puritans actually seized the Africans, and they say this is a violation of the biblical prohibition against man stealing. And so they freed these Africans and actually paid with their own money to send them back to Africa. Now, unfortunately, this is, I believe, the 1640s. Eventually, Massachusetts Bay did legally permit the institution of slavery. The other New England states did as well, as did the Mid-Atlantic states. It was never as important or as popular as it was in the American South. So you had slaves in these states, but very, very few. Between 1776 and 1804, as I said, 8 states voluntarily abolished slavery. This freed approximately 100,000 people, which is really interesting if you think about it, right? And this was at great economic cost. It's horrible to think in this way, right? But you and I invest in things. We invest in a house. We pay money for a house. We have a house. If the state comes along and just says, "Oh, this is no longer your house. It's going to be the people's house," we would object tremendously to that. In the same way, and it's not a good analogy, but in the same way, people had spent a lot of money to purchase slaves, to free the slaves. You can imagine there was a great outcry about that, just simply because of naked self-interest. And yet it was done nonetheless, I think, because many people, many founders, many political leaders at the time recognized that this is just a grave moral evil. You don't have a right to own another person in the same way that you and I have a right to own a house.
You made an interesting argument by analogy that between things that harm the environment and slavery. So, like you said, that today, not to say that, not to actually talk about the actual arguments of what's harming the environment and what's not, but just that the belief is the same, i.e., I don't believe that someone might not believe that driving an SUV that puts out a lot of emissions is really harming the environment that much. Just like that, I don't believe that you're saying that people for periods of 1600s to 1800s to 1900s didn't believe that slavery, having a slave, was a really bad thing, was really harming anybody. Is that kind of the idea, what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's a perfect analogy, because I think the case for global climate change and the contributions of mankind to that is far more contested than the case for the evil of slavery.
Okay.
It's just more of a thought experiment. Imagine in 300 years, we know for sure that internal combustion engines and jet planes are causing climate change that is very, very dangerous. Those of us living in the early 21st century, we kind of know these debates, but there's a lot of questions about them, right? And certainly not enough to keep Al Gore from having a 35,000 square foot house and flying here and there in the other place. The point is simply, what might seem so clear 300 years from now, for those of us living in the mix, is not so clear, right? And so I think to us, it seems so utterly obvious that slavery is an evil, horrible institution. Again, I think there was a general consensus, or we were coming to a general consensus in the late 18th century of this. At best, it was defended as a necessary evil. So people were defending it, but as something that, well, we're kind of stuck with this and we don't really have any option. Maybe we could free the slaves and send them back to Africa, but gosh, logistically that seemed really, really difficult. And in fact, it was impossible. Yeah, so that's sort of the way the analogy works in my mind anyway.
Yeah, that's really clear. It's sort of like how the idea is that most people today who don't believe in climate change, don't believe that's actually happening the way that their opponents are saying it. They don't really think that it's really a bad thing. And so too, back then, people that had slaves weren't doing it for nefarious, evil reasons, is what you're saying. At least in the American colonies, is what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. This is just sort of the way we've always done things. And maybe as a Christian, I know that I ought not to rape my slave. I ought to treat her with dignity and respect. So, one's ownership of a human being might be informed by Christian views or moral views more broadly. The case seems so clear, and I don't want to pretend there's any ambiguity in it. American chattel slavery was evil, and I praise those who came to fight it, those who ended that freed their own slaves. I mean, absolutely, they're on the right side of history, if I can use that phrase. But I think we have to have some humility. Why is it that James Madison never freed his slaves? again, it's a complicated issue, and we shouldn't say it was because he was just uniquely horribly evil. He's participating in an institution that had been around since the dawn of time. Really, the striking thing about America's founders is that they enacted practical laws and constitutional provisions to put slavery on the road to extinction or end it altogether. That's really what's unique about the American founding, and that's exactly what the 1619 Project misses.
Right. Right. The idea that it's not so much that Americans had slaves in the first few centuries, but that we ended it. That's the big story, is that we were trying to end it from the very beginning and trying to push it out of our lives, but that we actually did end it because was the common state of all humanity for all time. Christians were Jews in Egypt for a couple hundred years. Everyone had slaves. It was, I kind of consider this, and tell me if I'm being insensitive, but I don't want to be insensitive, but just like today, most everyone has employees or is an employee, right? So too, that's how the world was structured. You either had land and then you had employees, but you treated them as slaves. Is that similar?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good analogy. And again, one could imagine a future 300 years from now where it's just inconceivable that one person would work for another for cash payments. But to us, it's the air we breathe, right? It's the water in which we swim. It just comes very naturally. Where the analogy falls short, I think, and I'm not being critical of you, just where it falls short is I think by the time you get to the late 18th century, you have a lot of Americans who are recognizing that slavery is wrong. And again, they're taking concrete steps, individual steps. They're freeing their own slaves at great cost to themselves, or they're contributing to laws, statute, constitutional provisions to end slavery. So that's maybe where there's an
Yeah. Yeah. I don't want to equate slavery to employment. It's like like slavery is evil and brutal. Employment's not, but it's a different relative thing, culturally relative. For us, it's a notion that we all accept without question. In fact, it's a thing schools train you to do, go into employment, not to start your own business, but to be an employee of someone. And that's generally a good idea. But like to now, just in the 1800s, many people were thinking it's not a good idea to be a slave or have slaves. Also, right, just culturally relatively, people are realizing it's not as profitable an idea to only be an employee. You have to go off and sort of build your own brand and your own company and your own side projects, or have multiple streams of income. And so we're even culturally relatively moving away from that assumed paradigm of life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but again, employment is not like slavery. It's
right.
Employment is free by choice. Slavery was not. Slavery is evil, and employment is good, just not as good as you could grow in life. That's good. It's a stepping stone, and it's a good thing and even for certain people, it's the exact right place to be. You have a team, but the kind of employee is what I think matters a lot, and what you'll see change. You have an employee where you're just you trade hours for dollars. That's one level of employee versus you can grow up and get more equity in the company and partnership and seniority in the company. It's a similar sort of gradation of growth ladder that you can see. That's how you progress slavery or employment. What else do you think is the most important things being discussed and important for people to know in these conversations?
Sure. Well, with respect to the American founding, I think it's just critically important to understand the intellectual influences on America's founders. So you have plenty of scholars and popular authors that argues that these are men of the Enlightenment. They're secular rationalists that have abandoned their Christian convictions, and they're engaging in something entirely new. As I argue in Did America Have a Christian Founding, I think this is just hogwash. These were, by and large, people profoundly influenced by the Christian ideas, by their Christian traditions, especially by Calvinism. Something like 50 to 75% of America's founders were Calvinists, or reasonably called Calvinists. let me just give one example of where this matters with respect to constitutional design. And then if you want to shift over to things like religious liberty, church-state relations, we could do that. But I think constitutional design is just critically important. So Enlightenment political thought in the late 18th century was really heading in the direction of saying man is perfectible. Men are basically good, that all we need to do is educate them properly, and we can arrive in somewhat of a utopia. How are we going to get there? Well, obviously, we need a strong national government run by elite experts that can help guide the country using their reason and education into this utopia. America's founders said this is utterly ridiculous. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Even redeemed Christians are continuing to struggle with the old man within. So they very much feared strong central government. They created a constitutional design characterized by federalism. The national government would be one of very few enumerated powers. Read Article 1, Section 8. We would have a military, a post office, do international affairs, but really the national government would have very few powers. But even within those powers, we're going to separate powers very carefully between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. And then we're going to give each of these institutions the ability to check each other. Madison in Federalist 51 said if men were angels, government wouldn't be necessary. But men aren't angels, so we need government, and yet we need separation of powers and checks and balances and federalism to ensure that government does not become tyrannical.
So the way the American founding was, and the way the Constitution was constructed, was to counter and resist this idea of an elite group of experts that could run and build a utopian society, with the citizens being not involved, but being more like employees or subservient people. Was the American founding and the Constitution to counter that?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. So the American founders, almost to a person, there's some outliers, James Wilson and Alexander Hamilton perhaps, but by and large, they thought the government should be small and limited to doing the things that only governments can do, or can do best, right? Raising a military, fighting foreign wars, some sort of police department, police force, and that sort of thing. But even there, the national government should only do things that we really need a national government to do. Foreign affairs and the military. Other things like policing, this clearly belongs to the state or even more the local level, the town level, right? Same with education, same with poverty relief. To the extent to which governments are going to be involved in these things, they should be done by the most local unit possible if they're not done by other people, by families, by churches, by voluntary societies. Yeah, so America's founders believed in very limited government. I have on my shelf over here, I mentioned earlier, Roger Sherman, working with one other person, revised all of Connecticut statutes in 1783. They added the statute to put slavery on the road to extinction in Connecticut. They had a religious liberty statute. But what's really remarkable for our purposes is the statute book is just one volume, and it's a thin volume at that. State government in Connecticut was very minimal. To the extent to which other things were done by government, it would be done by the town or the local governments. And yet government was far less intrusive in people's lives. People were free to organize themselves as they saw fit, to form whatever churches they wanted, Congregationalist, Presbyterian, Baptist, Anglican. We just don't need the national government or a state government to organize us in these respects.
You're describing a picture of society in the world where the Americans' version of society is one where people are able to freely associate and do things, form organizations, institutions, and companies and groups, and associate religion, build churches. They can do all this living and societal work freely without the initiation by government. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
Describe a picture between that world, the American version of reality, versus one built by elites, where the society is built by elites and lead the people along. And what's an example of that in history?
Yeah, well, of course, if we can jump forward in time, the 20th century, fascism, communism, Mao's great leap forward, the Soviet Union. Let's focus on the Soviet Union. I think this is the best example where you have a a revolutionary movement that says, okay, we're going to concentrate all power in Moscow, and we're going to reform the people. We're going to remake the people. We're going to kill those that disagree with us. We're going to re-educate everyone else. We're going to control everything within the state. Maybe we'll permit a few churches to continue to exist, but clearly they're going to be under the thumb of Moscow in the hopes of bringing about utopia. And this is the problem with utopian speculations. You can justify almost anything if you think that if we only do A, B, and C, we will arrive at heaven on earth. It's incredibly dangerous, an incredibly dangerous idea.
That's perfect. I think that's exactly a great, clear definition. I think that some major things in the world and in American society have come to light in the last year, since January, and the last 4 years. My suspicions are that you've seen the side of the radical leftist fascists come to light. But I want to hear, instead of me going through what I think I've seen happen, what have you seen happen? And what's the story behind everything? Behind why Trump won, what the left's been trying to do, what has been going on, what was Obama and Biden doing during their administration, what kind of world have they been trying to build, and are they trying to build with the Clintons now?
Yeah, boy, that's a huge question. Personally, I don't like Trump. I think he's a man of very low character. I cast a protest vote in 2016. I've been pleasantly surprised. His judicial appointments have been stellar. He hasn't the proclivity to attack other nations like both George W. Bush and Barack Obama did. His economic policies have been tolerably good. So I'm actually pleased with what he's actually done as president. And in 2020, I will, in fact, vote for him. I think he did tap into a segment of American life, the blue-collar worker that basically felt ignored by the elites of the Democratic Party and elites like Mitt Romney of the Republican Party. And this, of course, allowed him to win these key battleground states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and become president of the United States. More broadly, I live right outside of Portland, Oregon, where we've had constant rioting, literally rioting. I'm not talking about protests. We've had protests too, but rioting where just last week, they got Abraham Lincoln. They tore down the statue of Abraham Lincoln and beheaded him, and Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, it's just utterly insane. These Antifa riots. There are people who want to use power to bring about their version of utopia. And if you're in the way of this, you will be harmed. You will be perhaps even killed. There was a Trump supporter that they literally shot down in Portland. Now, this is extreme, and most people on the political left are not like this, obviously. But I think in terms of this cancel culture, we're seeing more and more of this. That one stray comment that's viewed as not being sensitive enough with respect to LGBTQ issues, for instance, with respect to race relations, can easily lose a professor his or her job. It can lead to a politician being forced out of office. It can lead to a corporate executive being fired. And this is just scary. It's obviously the right thing to fight racism today. Racism still exists, and it ought to be confronted. But the BLM movements, and especially Antifa movements, are using really authoritarian means to eradicate racism or perceived racism in ways that just simply do not make sense and are counterproductive, I would suggest.
What's the most astonishing thing to me is, I agree with everything you said, is why do people they see everything as a coincidence that just happened over the last 12, 16, 18 months and 4 years. Oh, it just happened to be this way. Trump has happened to win, and then the left, Pelosi, just happened to immediately plan a coup, immediately plan impeachment. It just happened to be this way. And then they've been trying to impeach Trump ever since. They did not accept the results of the people. And this just happened to be this way. And then it just happened that they impeached him in November of last year. And then there's happened to be a virus. And then there just happened to be Biden winning. And then he just happened not to be able to speak in public. So they just happened to close down the world so he couldn't speak in public. This all just happened to be. Then there just happened to be a guy shot, a black guy shot Floyd, or killed, and then there's happened to be race riots all of a sudden. Everyone was just happened to be put in their homes, locked away. All they could watch was this fear news,
Hmm.
and they couldn't talk to people. And then it just all these things just happened to go according to plan. Um, I don't know why people think that these are all just coincidences, but if you listen to the mainstream media, it can be seductive. But what is the bigger picture? Is BLM and Antifa are they just isolated instances? There's some people over here that happen to be doing this. There's just some people over here that happen to be doing that. Is there any cohesion of the story? Are they connected at all with the people that are running for office, with the Chinese Communist Party? Is there any way to make sense of all this? I think there is, but what do you think?
Yeah, that's again that's a huge question. You're good with coming up with huge questions. I think in part, if I can begin with somewhat of a pedantic answer, America lived with the constitutional regime that came out of Philadelphia for roughly 150 years. Then, in the midst of a Great Depression, the rise of fascism, we sort of tossed a lot of that out of the window in the 1930s and said, okay, we want the national government to solve our problems. And so you have the New Deal and all sorts of things that historically would not have been permitted and initially were struck down. But then, of course, Roosevelt wins re-election in 1936 and threatens to pack the court. And again, this kind of goes to your point. There's nothing new here, right? Joe Biden is not entertaining something that he just came up with. The Democrats in the 1930s were pursuing this vision. And so I think we largely gave up on limited national government in the 1930s. Since the 1930s, Congress gets to do pretty much whatever Congress wants, with the exception of maybe some specific limitations of the Bill of Rights. Along with this, you then have the rise of the national judiciary, for one excellent reason. Brown versus a Board of Education, 1954 desegregated schools in the American South. And most right-thinking people say that was an excellent decision, even if it might be a violation of federalism. Still, the result is good. We like that. And so we started turning more and more to the US Supreme Court to solve all of our problems. And so today, unfortunately, Democrats and Republicans alike, and Republicans are not immune from this, tend to think if there's a problem, let's turn to the national government to fix it. So constitutional government out the window. Now, some of the trends you're talking about, I think, are a bit more nefarious than that. And they come out of the academy, which is always kind of on the leading edge of bad ideas. Unfortunately, it doesn't have to be that way, but since the mid 20th century, I think it has been the way. We used to talk about political correctness in the 1980s, 1990s, right? This idea that people must be a certain way, that they must use a certain language, and if they don't, we will get them. We will not tenure them. We will fire them, and this sort of thing. And this idea is utterly pervasive in the American academy, the elite academy especially. Small Christian colleges like George Fox University, where I teach, is relatively reasonable in this respect. But the elite liberal arts colleges like Williams and Swarthmore, the major R1 institutions like Wisconsin and Cornell and Yale, they're just gone. They're completely gone. And these ideas then spill out into society, so that you see these horrible riots where the BLM/Antifa protesters will surround people and insist that they raise a fist and chant something, whatever it might be. And I don't care. And even if it's not a bad thing they're pursuing, they're opposed to racism, they're opposed to the killing of George Floyd, as every right-thinking person should be. But to try to force people to communicate a message, it's just fascism, and it's tremendously worrisome. And I hope the nation wakes up to this soon. I mean, it's just scary, and yet I worry that we're going in the opposite direction.
So it sounds like you're saying there is this underpinning culture of totalitarianism, in that people think, here's how the world should be run. And so to bring that about, that's the most important thing, bring it about. So we have to do whatever we can, to you, Brandon, to you, Mark, to get you on board with the project. Was that what you saw in the formation of the Soviet Union, and with Mao in the formation of the Communist Chinese Republic?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Let me just give one additional example that I'm sure your listeners are familiar with. So you have a 65-year-old grandmother in Washington who's a florist. She knowingly employs LGBTQ individuals. She knowingly serves LGBTQ couples, two gay men specifically in this case. They come to her after Washington legalized the same-sex marriage, and they say, "Would you please bake us a wedding cake?" That would communicate an idea. She hugs the people. She says, "I'm sorry, I can't do this. It violates my religious conviction." In a world, and we might think that's a wrong decision, right? I don't care. In a world of free individuals, that would be the end of it. There are dozens of florists in the Tri-City areas of Washington that would gladly bake this cake. But instead, the couple runs off to the ACLU and they sue the woman. The attorney general of the state, who would never be involved in a case of this matter, decides to sue the pants off of her. I mean, it's utterly insane. We have to compel her to engage in this activity that we deem appropriate. We cannot allow the 65-year-old grandmother to act upon her religious convictions if they cut against what's considered to be good social policy. Utterly insane. Utterly insane.
Thank you. Um, can you talk about the Democrat Party? Because my understanding is that in our last topic, that I want to say it's been good. I want to say it's been good, and I want to edify people that Christians, especially, that have been associated with it, and say you've been doing it for good reasons. I'm sure. But does it seem to you that the Democratic Party has been overtaken, unfortunately, by nefarious totalitarian powers? What do you think's happened?
Yeah, I would say those sorts of if we can say a faction within the Democratic Party has become far stronger. I think you obviously have sort of extreme radicals like AOC, who is far to the left of someone like even a Joe Biden. But yeah, the direction is absolutely worrisome. And I think one of the explanations is over the last 20 years, we have seen an incredible rise of people without religious affiliation. They aren't claiming to be atheists, but say, yeah, I'm kind of religious, but I don't connect myself with any denomination or with any, with even a sect like Protestantism or Catholicism. And these people tend to be, and I'm not being critical of them for their religious choices, but just reality politically, they tend to be, say, incredibly pro-choice, incredibly pro-LGBTQ rights, and very, very intolerant of people who disagree with them. They vote almost uniformly for Democratic candidates. So I think you have seen a shift in the party. If you go back to the 80s, it just boggles your mind. Back in the 80s, people like Al Gore, Bill Clinton, Jesse Jackson were actually pro-life, right? Before they had national aspirations.
Hmm.
It is almost inconceivable to think of a Democratic candidate nowadays that is pro-life. Occasionally, one will pop up in the South, but it's a rare breed. It's an utterly rare breed.
Isn't the pro-life issue, shouldn't that be the card that overrides everything else? That is abortion not killing babies and mass genocide? And well, at least if one believes that it is, if one believes that abortion is killing babies and mass genocide, should that, if they believe that, should that not also compel them to realize that whoever supports that mass killing of babies can't be? You can't allow it, no matter whatever else they believe.
Yeah, I think it definitely has to be one of our top issues, right? 60 million unborn babies killed since Roe versus Wade. I mean, it's just ridiculous, right? We are the closest we've been since 1992 to overturning Roe versus Wade with Trump's nomination of Amy Coney Barrett. This is one of the reasons I've decided to vote for Trump in 2020. The Supreme Court was split 4-4 in 2016 after the death of Nino Scalia. Had Hillary Clinton won, she would have replaced Scalia with a progressive. Maybe Kennedy wouldn't have retired, but Ruth Bader Ginsburg almost certainly would have retired or passed away. And so it'd be looking at a court that is at least 6 progressives to 4 conservatives. Instead, we're looking at the possibility of a 6-person, maybe a 7-person, hopefully in the next term, conservative court, which may very well overturn Roe versus Wade. Overturning Roe versus Wade, as you know, would return the issue of abortion to the states, so it wouldn't end abortion overnight, but probably 22 states would ban abortion, and that would save a lot of lives. So yeah, it's a key issue. I mentioned earlier, I think I mentioned it here. I was in a debate last night where I basically made the argument that
Yes.
Christians not to vote for Donald Trump. I very much appreciate Trump's lack of desire to attack other countries. George W. Bush, the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, Barack Obama, and the virtual invasion of Syria and Libya killed a lot of innocent people. And so I think we need to recognize that Trump is not attacking other countries. And this is a very good thing. It's preserving innocent human life. And I'm not a pacifist. I understand that sometimes military force has to be used. But I think recent presidents have been far too prone to use it too often and too broadly.
Yeah. I think you were exactly right. And I think that this is to sum everything up. It seems to me, and when you see what it seems to you, that you really have a choice between two sides, not two candidates. I almost view the candidates as not being the most important thing in this election. You have a choice between two sides, totalitarianism or freedom. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think then tactically, it makes more sense to align with the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. But unfortunately, I think Republicans, as I suggested earlier, are still far too prone to go to the national government for solutions. And so within our choice to work within the Republican Party, we need to be very critical of some of these aspects, some factions within the Republican Party, to try to move back to a sense of federalism. Let's
Yes.
get the government, national government, out of the business of doing most of what it does.
And that's
And
the exact thing that the left, my friends, want. They think that's what they want. They want a bigger national government. And they want to have no states, no electoral college. They want pure democracy, a mob rule, which is just like what you said. It's what the Soviet Union was. It's what China is. It's just where they can control the whole system. And that's the problem.
that's exactly right.
You
Exactly
can't have
right.
free people in free states doing different things. So I can choose where I want to go, and you can see what works and what doesn't. It eliminates the ability for people to be free, but then just be controlled by the system that the experts say is what should happen, right?
No, that's right. But it's sort of funny, right? Your friends on the left kind of like federalism when it comes to marijuana, right? They like that. Oregon and Washington and Colorado can legalize marijuana, whereas many states do not, because at a national level, we aren't going to legalize that anytime soon. And that's a great example, I think. I'm not a big fan. I've never tried marijuana in my life. I'm not a big fan of it. But I kind of like that we have states being able to make choices about that. I understand the arguments for the legalization of marijuana. I'm not a libertarian. Legalizing all currently illegal drugs seems like a horrible idea, but I can understand the rationale behind legalizing marijuana, but let it be done at the state level. And then we can look at Oregon and Washington, Colorado, and see how it works out and see if we should expand this policy or not, instead of having a one-size-fits-all policy, one national law banning marijuana everywhere or making it legal everywhere. It's just ridiculous.
Mark David Hall, you were a true gem and bright light that helps clarify so many things. Your voice is so important, and what you've shared is so important to help understand what really has been our founding, it has been our history. So thank you. And I'm going to give you a link, everyone, a link to buy Mark's book. What's it called again? Did America have a Christian founding? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I've read it myself, and it's really spot on and fantastic because we get to lay out everything that you just said, and I'm going to lay out most everything that you said too on your Thought Leadership blog, so we can understand everything you said. This whole really supremely important. Thanks so much for your time and talking.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Brandon. It's been my pleasure.
Awesome. Bye-bye.
All right.